Sir, that number will ruin you. The words slipped into the air so quietly they almost didn't belong in a room like this. But they landed anyway, sharp enough to cut through the applause still echoing beneath the chandeliers as Graham Sterling stood at the center of the ballroom. Pen poised above a $10 million pledge while cameras hovered inches from his face and 100 tailored suits waited for the signature that would headline tomorrow's news. His smile fixed, practiced, untouchable until it faltered just slightly. His eyes shifting toward the voice that had no right to interrupt him. A waitress, young, black, standing with a silver tray balanced in one hand and something steadier in her gaze. Ava Coleman didn't move closer at first, didn't raise her voice, didn't apologize. She simply repeated it, softer this time, like she was speaking a fact the room hadn't earned yet. You're missing a zero, and for a fraction of a second nothing happened. Then everything did. The clink of glasses stopped mid-air. A laugh caught in someone's throat. The air conditioning hummed too loud against the sudden silence as Graham let out a small breath that almost sounded like amusement, the kind reserved for interruptions that don't matter. Except this one lingered, because Ava wasn't looking down, wasn't backing away. She tilted the document slightly with 2 fingers, careful not to smudge it, pointing to the line total with a precision that didn't belong to someone pouring champagne for a living. The written amount and the numeric line don't match, she added, calm, steady, and that was when the shift began, subtle at first, a tightening in Graham's jaw, a flicker in the eyes of his legal advisor, the kind of flicker that comes when something feels off but hasn't been named yet. Someone near the back let out a quiet chuckle. Another whispered something about staff overstepping, but Ava didn't react, her grip on the tray firm, knuckles pale against the polished metal. She had seen this before. Numbers that didn't line up, details people with power assumed no one else would notice, and she knew what it meant. Not just a typo, not just a small mistake, but a public contradiction that would unravel under scrutiny. Tax filings, press releases, audited statements, all telling different stories, and now all of it balanced on the tip of a pen hovering over paper. Graham finally looked down, really looked this time. The room leaning with him as if pulled by gravity, the stage lights reflecting off the ink, off the single missing zero that sat there quietly, waiting to be seen, and somewhere in that silence, something cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for doubt to enter a man who built his empire on never doubting himself. His pen didn't move. His smile didn't return, and for the first time that night, the most powerful man in the room wasn't in control of what happened next. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like air pressure changing before a storm, subtle but impossible to ignore as Graham Sterling kept his eyes on the paper a second longer than he should have. Then another, and across the table his chief financial officer leaned in without being asked, drawn by something he could not yet name, his hand hovering just above the document before finally touching it, turning the page. Slightly under the bright white light, scanning, pausing, scanning again. And that was when his expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for the cameras to catch, but enough for the people closest to him to feel it. A tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw, the kind of reaction that does not belong in a room built on certainty. Graham noticed it immediately. Of course he did. Men like him did not miss shifts in power, even the smallest ones. His voice when he spoke was controlled, quiet, almost too calm, asking a simple question that carried far more weight than it sounded. Is there a problem? And the chief financial officer did not answer right away, which was answer enough, because hesitation did not exist in their world unless something had gone wrong. Somewhere behind them a glass touched the table a little too hard. Someone shifted in their chair. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of a moment that was supposed to be flawless, polished, rehearsed, and now stretched thin by something as small as a missing zero. Ava remained exactly where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, her tray steady, her posture quiet but unyielding. She could feel the weight of the room pressing against her, the unspoken question of who she thought she was to interrupt something like this, but she did not look at them. She looked at the numbers, because numbers did not care about status. They did not bend for titles or tailored suits. They either aligned or they did not. And this one did not. The chief financial officer finally exhaled, low enough that only those closest could hear, then leaned toward Graham. murmuring something that did not need to be loud to carry its meaning. The kind of sentence that begins with confirmation and ends with consequence. Graham's fingers tightened slightly around the pen that was no longer touching the paper, his gaze dropping again, slower this time, more deliberate, tracing the line where the discrepancy lived, and in that moment the room understood before anyone said it out loud. This was not a suggestion. This was not a misunderstanding. This was real. The number written in ink did not match the amount spelled out in words. A difference that would not stay hidden once it left this room. A difference that would be printed, analyzed, questioned, and judged by people who did not care how powerful he was. The applause that had filled the space minutes ago felt distant now, like something from another night. Graham straightened slightly, not enough to reclaim control, just enough to keep from losing it completely. And for the first time since Ava had spoken, he looked at her directly. Really looked, not at the uniform, not at the tray, but at the calm certainty in her eyes, the kind that did not come from guessing. And the room waited, because whatever he did next would decide not just the moment, but everything that followed. The air in the ballroom held its breath as Graham Sterling's gaze lingered on Ava longer than anyone expected, not with irritation now, but with calculation, the kind that measured risk in fractions of seconds and consequences in millions of dollars. His thumb brushing lightly against the edge of the paper, as if confirming the texture would somehow change what was written there. But it did not. The numbers remained stubborn, indifferent, and across from him the chief financial officer gave the smallest nod, a silent confirmation that could not be undone. Somewhere near the stage a woman shifted in her seat and whispered something that sounded like doubt, not about the numbers, but about how this was happening at all. How? A moment designed for applause had turned into something far more fragile. Graham straightened slowly, drawing in a breath that expanded his chest, but did not restore the confidence that had filled the room minutes earlier. His voice, when it came, was lower, stripped of the performative warmth it had carried before. "Explain it," he said, not to Ava, not yet, but to his own advisor, and the man hesitated again, choosing words carefully, because language mattered when reputation was on the line. "The numeric value is short by 10 compared to the written amount," he said quietly, precise, clinical, and that was when the truth settled into the room fully, not as a possibility, but as a fact, the kind that did not ask for permission, the kind that simply existed. Graham's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his eyes flicking once more to the document, then back to Ava, and this time there was no dismissal in his expression, no trace of the earlier assumption that she did not belong in this moment. Instead, there was something else, something closer to recognition, because she had not spoken loudly. She had not tried to command attention. She had simply been correct, and correctness carried its own authority, even in a room that valued power above all else. Ava felt the shift before anyone said it out loud, the subtle realignment of perception. The way eyes that had dismissed her seconds ago now measured her differently, not as staff, but as a variable that had altered the outcome of the night. Her heartbeat remained steady, not because she was unaffected, but because she had learned long ago that staying calm was the only way to be heard when no one expected you to speak. She adjusted her grip on the tray slightly, the metal cool against her fingers, grounding, familiar, real, unlike the tension that now filled the space. Graham took a step back from the table, just enough to create distance between himself and the document, as if physical space could buy him time to think. But the cameras were still there, the audience still watching, and time was the one thing he did not have. A decision had to be made, not just about the number, but about how to respond to the person who had revealed it. And in that pause, that thin, stretched second where everything balanced on what he would say next, the power in the room shifted again, quieter this time, but undeniable, because for the first time that evening, the narrative did not belong to Graham Sterling. It belonged to the woman who had seen what everyone else had missed. "Then fix it," Graham said. But his voice no longer carried the effortless authority it had minutes ago. It was tighter now, edged with something unfamiliar, urgency mixed with restraint, as he placed the pen down beside the document instead of signing it. A small motion that echoed louder than any speech could have, because everyone in the room understood what it meant. The moment had shifted beyond performance into consequence. His chief financial officer moved immediately, pulling the document closer, flipping to the supporting pages, checking the digital copy on the tablet held by an assistant, movements quick but controlled. The kind of precision that came from knowing mistakes like this were never supposed to happen. Especially not here, not under lights, not in front of donors and cameras, and people who measured credibility in seconds. Ava remained still, but now the space around her felt different, less dismissive, more charged, as if the room itself had adjusted to her presence. The manager who had been inching closer to intervene stopped halfway, uncertain now, caught between protocol and the undeniable reality unfolding in front of him. Someone near the stage cleared their throat, another guest leaned in to whisper, but their voices felt distant, secondary to the quiet recalculations happening at the center of the room. Graham's eyes did not leave the document for long, but when they lifted again, they went straight to Ava, direct, focused, searching not for defiance, but for certainty, and she did not look away. She did not soften her stance or try to justify herself. She simply held the same calm expression, the same quiet confidence that had brought everything to a halt. "Where did you see it?" he asked, and this time the question was meant for her, not as a challenge, but as a request for clarity. Ava shifted her tray slightly under her arm, freeing one hand as she stepped just close enough to indicate the exact line, without crossing the invisible boundary that still separated her role from his world. "Here," she said, her finger hovering just above the ink, careful not to touch. The written amount says 10 million, but the numeric entry is 1 million, and the transfer schedule matches the lower figure. Her voice remained even, professional, not trying to impress, only to be precise, and that precision landed harder than any raised voice could have. The chief financial officer glanced up briefly, then back down, confirming her explanation with a short nod, the kind that carried more weight than a full statement. Graham exhaled slowly, a controlled release of tension that did not fully leave his body, because the implications were already unfolding in his mind. Press coverage, financial disclosures, questions he would not be able to dismiss, all avoided by a detail caught by someone who was never meant to be part of this conversation. The irony did not escape him, nor did the cost of ignoring it. He straightened again, this time with intention, not to reclaim dominance, but to re-establish direction. "Update the document," he said, his tone firmer. "Now," directed at his team, "correct the numeric value and verify all copies before anything goes public." The room responded immediately, movement returning in controlled bursts, assistants stepping in, screens lighting up, quiet voices coordinating. But the energy had changed. It was no longer about celebration. It was about correction, about control regained through acknowledgement rather than denial. And in the middle of it all, Ava stepped back into stillness, returning to her place as if nothing had happened. But nothing was the same, because every person in that room now knew exactly who had prevented a mistake that could not have been hidden, and more importantly, who had chosen to speak when silence would have been easier. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not. Even as movement resumed and assistants quietly replaced pages and confirmed figures across devices, the rhythm had changed. The easy confidence replaced by something more careful, more aware, like everyone had just been reminded that perfection was fragile. Graham Sterling stood at the center of it, no longer the unquestioned axis of the night, but still its focal point, his hands now empty, the pen resting untouched beside the corrected document, as if it no longer belonged to him in the same way. He glanced once toward the cameras, then away, calculating not how to perform, but how to recover. Because recovery required something different than control. It required acknowledgement, and that was not a language he used often. Across the room a few guests exchanged looks that carried more meaning than words: curiosity, surprise, a quiet reassessment of what they had just witnessed, not the mistake itself, but who had revealed it. Ava had already stepped back into the soft perimeter of the service space, her tray balanced once more, her posture composed, as if she had simply completed another task. But the air around her felt altered, charged with a recognition that had not been there before. Some eyes lingered a second longer when they passed her. Others avoided her entirely, unsure how to reconcile the uniform with the authority she had just displayed. The manager approached her cautiously now, no longer with urgency or correction, but with a kind of restrained confusion, leaning in just enough to speak without drawing attention. "Stay available," he said quietly, his tone stripped of the earlier edge. Ava nodded once. Nothing more, because there was nothing more to say. She had done what she needed to do, and whatever came next was no longer in her control. Back at the table, the revised document was placed in front of Graham again, the corrected number clean, aligned, precise, as if it had always been that way. But everyone knew it had not, and that knowledge lingered in the space between action and perception. Graham looked at it for a moment, then lifted his gaze, scanning the room, not for approval, but for alignment, making sure the moment could move forward without breaking again. When he finally reached for the pen, the motion was slower, more deliberate, and when the tip touched the paper, there was no applause. Not yet. Only a quiet attention, a collective holding of breath as he signed, the ink flowing smoothly this time. No hesitation, no error, just a line that closed the gap that had almost defined the night. Only after he finished did the room respond, a measured wave of clapping. That felt different from before, less automatic, more aware, as if the people in the room understood they were not just witnessing generosity, but correction, not just a gesture, but a moment that had nearly gone wrong and had been pulled back at the last possible second. Graham set the pen down again, but this time he did not step away. Instead he turned, not to the audience, not to the cameras, but toward the edge of the room where Ava stood, and for a brief second that stretched longer than it should have, his gaze found hers again, steady, acknowledging, not publicly yet, not with words, but with something quieter, something that did not need amplification to be understood, and in that silent exchange, the hierarchy of the room shifted once more, not loudly, not visibly, but enough that anyone paying attention could feel it. Because the night was no longer just about a pledge, it was about who had made sure that pledge meant what it claimed to mean. The applause faded faster this time, not because it was weaker, but because something heavier had settled beneath it, something quieter than celebration, the kind of awareness that lingers after a near mistake has been seen too clearly to ignore. The chandeliers above cast the same warm light across polished tables and crystal glasses, but the room no longer felt untouched. It felt observed, measured, recalibrated. Ava moved through the edges of the ballroom again, her steps light, practiced, the soft sound of her shoes against the floor blending into the low hum of resumed conversation. She refilled glasses, adjusted place settings, performed the small precise motions that defined her role, but inside her, the moment had not passed. It lingered in the steady rhythm of her breath, in the way her fingers still remembered the exact line where the number had been wrong. She did not look toward the stage again, not because she was avoiding it, but because she had learned long ago that once you spoke truth into a room that was not expecting it, you did not chase the reaction, you let it find you. Near the center of the ballroom, Graham remained where he stood, though the program had moved on. Another speaker had taken the microphone, words about impact and generosity filling the air, but his attention drifted, not outward, but inward, replaying the sequence with a precision that mirrored the numbers he trusted so completely. The missing zero, the hesitation, the quiet correction, the realization that control had nearly slipped through something so small, and more than that it had been someone outside his system who had caught it, someone his world was not built to notice. His hand rested briefly against the edge of the table, fingers tapping once, twice, not in impatience, but in thought, as if grounding himself in the present while something deeper shifted beneath it. Across the room, a pair of investors spoke in low tones, one gesturing subtly toward Ava as she passed, their expressions not mocking, not dismissive, but curious, recalculating. The narrative had changed, and people who understood power could feel it even when it was not spoken aloud. Ava paused near a side station, setting down a tray for a moment, her shoulders lowering just slightly as she took a breath she had not realized she had been holding. The air smelled faintly of citrus and polished wood, familiar, steady, nothing like the charged silence that had filled the room earlier. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, not to escape, but to settle, to return to herself after stepping into a space that had not been meant for her voice, and yet had held it anyway. When she opened them again, the room was moving forward, conversations rebuilding, laughter returning in measured tones, but something remained altered, a subtle shift in how people looked at her, not overt, not announced, but present, like a change in light you only notice when you compare it to what came before. And at the far end of the ballroom, Graham finally moved. Not toward the stage, not toward the cameras, but toward the edges, toward the place where service and spectacle met. His pace unhurried, deliberate, as if he were crossing a boundary he had never needed to cross before. And though no one announced it, no one paused the evening to acknowledge it, the distance between them was no longer just physical. It was something else entirely, something that had been quietly rewritten in a moment that could not be undone by the time Graham reached the edge of the ballroom. The distance between intention and action had already narrowed into something unavoidable, the soft murmur of conversations continuing behind him. Like a current he had stepped out of, his polished shoes making almost no sound against the floor as he approached the service station where Ava stood, her hands steady as she arranged a line of untouched glasses, the motion precise, practiced, as if nothing of consequence had happened at all. But he stopped a few feet away, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to remain distant. And for a moment he did not speak, because there was no script for this, no prepared line that could restore the balance that had shifted. Ava sensed him before she looked up, not through sound, but through presence, the subtle change in the air that comes when attention narrows onto a single point. She lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his without hesitation, without deference, just awareness. And that was where the moment settled, not in tension, but in recognition. Graham exhaled quietly, a breath that carried more weight than his earlier speech. "You were right," he said. The words simple, unadorned, stripped of performance, and they hung between them longer than expected, because in a room built on authority, acknowledgement like that was rare. Ava gave a small nod, not out of validation, but because the statement did not require anything more. She had not spoken to be proven right. She had spoken because it needed to be said, and he seemed to understand that, his eyes shifting briefly to the tray in her hands, then back to her face, as if recalibrating the way he saw her. "Where did you learn to catch something like that?" he asked, his tone quieter now, not demanding, but genuinely searching. Ava adjusted her grip slightly, the cool metal grounding her as she answered. "Accounting classes, before I had to leave school." Her voice even, factual, offering no more detail than necessary. Graham absorbed that, a flicker of something crossing his expression, not pity, not surprise, something closer to realization, because the gap between who she was and where she stood had just been made visible in a way that could not be ignored. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if placing that information into a system he trusted, but could no longer fully rely on. "You saved me from a mistake that would have cost more than money," he said. And this time the words carried weight beyond the immediate moment, a recognition of consequence, of image, of trust. Ava did not respond right away, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, because she understood something he was only beginning to grasp, that what she had done was not extraordinary. It was simply paying attention, something the room had not been doing. "It was just numbers," she said finally, and there was no modesty in it, just truth. Because numbers did not bend, they did not adjust themselves to protect anyone. They either aligned or they exposed what did not. Graham let out a faint breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, not from amusement, but from the clarity of it, the simplicity of what had nearly undone him. He glanced briefly back toward the ballroom, then returned his attention to her, as if deciding something in that space between movement and stillness. "What is your name?" he asked. Though he likely already knew, because details like that were rarely left unrecorded in his world. But asking it now meant something different. Ava met his gaze fully as she answered, "Ava Coleman." And in that moment, her name did not disappear into the background. It settled, clear and present, in a place where it would not be overlooked again. Graham repeated it once, quietly, as if testing its weight, then nodded, a subtle shift in posture signaling a decision that had not yet been spoken, but was already forming. And around them, the night continued, unaware that something far more significant than a corrected number had just begun to take shape. For a moment neither of them moved, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the weight of what had already been said was enough, the kind of silence that did not demand to be filled. Graham stood there with the faintest shift in his posture, no longer the distance of a man above the room, but not yet fully part of the space he had stepped into, and Ava held her ground with the same quiet steadiness that had carried her through the moment that changed everything. Her tray still balanced, her role still visible, but no longer defining the boundaries of who she was in his eyes. The music in the ballroom softened into the background, a low hum of piano and conversation that seemed to blur at the edges as if the world had narrowed to just this exchange. Graham glanced briefly toward the stage again, where the program continued without pause, speeches unfolding, applause rising and falling in practiced intervals. But it felt distant now, like something he was expected to return to rather than something he belonged to in that moment. When he looked back at Ava, there was a decision in his expression, not impulsive, not reactive, but formed, deliberate, the kind that came after recalculation. "You said you studied accounting," he began, his tone measured, not offering, not demanding, but opening a space. Ava nodded once, her eyes steady. "Yes, sir," she replied, the word habit rather than submission, a reflex shaped by years of being in rooms where her place was always defined before she spoke. Graham noticed it, the way the word sat differently now than it might have minutes ago, and something in his expression shifted again, subtle, but real. "Do not call me sir," he said quietly, not as correction, but as adjustment, leveling something that had never been equal before. Ava blinked once, just once, absorbing it, then gave a small nod. The shift acknowledged without needing to be named. Graham continued, his voice steady. "My firm has a compliance division that reviews financial disclosures before they go public, people who are paid very well to catch exactly what you saw tonight." He paused for a fraction of a second, letting that reality settle between them. And they missed it. The admission was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried more weight than any public statement he had made that evening. Ava did not react outwardly, but the meaning was clear. The system had failed, and she had not. Graham reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a card, simple, understated, the kind that did not need embellishment to carry authority. He held it for a moment, then extended it toward her, not forcing it into her hand, just offering it, leaving the choice with her. "If you are serious about finishing what you started," he said, his tone even, grounded, "call this number tomorrow. Ask for my office. Tell them I sent you." Ava looked at the card, then at him, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the tray before she shifted it to one hand and accepted the card with the other. The motion small, but significant, because it was not just paper. It was a doorway, one she had not expected, one she had not asked for, but one that now existed, real and immediate. She did not smile, did not express gratitude in the way the room might expect. Instead, she met his gaze and nodded once, firm, acknowledging the opportunity without diminishing herself in the process. Graham held her gaze for a moment longer, as if confirming something unspoken, then stepped back, not abruptly, not dismissively, but with the quiet understanding that the moment had reached its natural end. He turned and began to walk back toward the center of the ballroom, toward the stage, toward the role he knew how to play. But something in the way he moved had changed, less certain, more aware, and Ava remained where she was, the card now resting lightly in her hand, its edges sharp against her skin. A tangible reminder that sometimes the smallest detail, the one everyone else overlooked, was enough to change everything without raising your voice at all. The night carried on as if nothing had happened, as if the music had not faltered, as if the applause had not hesitated, as if a single missing detail had not nearly unraveled something carefully constructed. But for those who had seen it, truly seen it, the room felt different, quieter beneath the surface. Ava moved through the final stretch of her shift with the same steady rhythm, clearing glasses, resetting tables, her hands remembering every motion even as her mind returned again and again to the weight of the card resting in her apron pocket, its edges pressing lightly against the fabric with every step, a small, constant reminder that something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Near the center of the ballroom, Graham resumed his place, his voice returning to the microphone with the same clarity it had always carried. But there was a difference now, subtle, almost imperceptible, the confidence still there, but tempered, grounded in a way it had not been before, as if the illusion of perfection had been replaced with something more real, more deliberate, The guests responded in kind, their attention focused, their expressions measured, because the night was no longer just about what was being given. It was about what had almost been overlooked, and who had made sure it was not. As the event drew to a close, the lights softened slightly. Conversations began to loosen, laughter returning in warmer tones, the formal edges of the evening dissolving into something more human. Ava stepped into the service hallway for a moment, the door closing behind her with a quiet click that muted the sound of the ballroom. The air cooler here, simpler, free of expectation. She reached into her apron and pulled out the card, holding it between her fingers, turning it once under the fluorescent light. The name printed clean and sharp, a direct line into a world that had never made space for her before. She did not smile, did not rush. She simply looked at it, letting the reality settle, because she understood something that had nothing to do with opportunity, something deeper, something steadier. That the moment had not changed who she was, it had revealed it, and that mattered more than anything written on a piece of paper. After a second, she slipped the card back into her pocket, not as something fragile, but as something earned, and when she stepped back into the ballroom, the final guests were beginning to leave, coats gathered, goodbyes exchanged, the night closing in layers of quiet movement. Graham stood near the exit now, shaking hands, offering brief words, his presence still commanding, but his attention sharper, more aware of the details that moved around him. And as Ava passed by with her tray one last time, their eyes met again, not long, not dramatic, just a single second of recognition, the kind that did not need to be spoken to be understood. He gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, and she returned it just as simply, no more, no less, because the moment between them had already said everything it needed to say. And as the doors opened and the night air drifted in, cool against the warmth of the room, Ava walked forward, steady, unhurried, the sound of her steps blending into the quiet end of the evening, leaving behind a space that would return to normal by morning, but never quite the same, because somewhere in the memory of that room, in the silence between applause and correction, there would always be the echo of a voice that spoke when it was not expected and was heard when it mattered most.